Those of you that are here today and you have a vehicle, probably you would say, like me, it's nice having a vehicle, a car, truck, whatever it is that you have. And it's kind of a strange thought. It hasn't been that long that we were or have as people been able to experience something that we've been so often taking for granted, and that is that, for example, this afternoon, after this service is over, I could get in the car and I could be at the beach later this afternoon. I could go to the mountains. I could head towards our nation's capital. I mean, I could cover hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles in one day just because of having the flexibility of that car. It's wonderful, the ease of transportation that it affords me. I also like not simply that I can get quickly from one place to another. It is not simply that it can carry me, but I can carry other people and I can carry stuff. I could, for example, this afternoon go over to Walmart and buy 20 bags of groceries, and I don't have to lug them all back myself. I can jam them into the car and I can bring them home. All of these are wonderful blessings. Having a vehicle is a great thing. But having that vehicle comes with some aggravations, doesn't it? Having that vehicle comes with some things that are, well, they are costs. I mean, for one thing, you've got out of the gate the cost of purchasing the vehicle, which now is, I don't know, it's like $1 million, I think, to buy like an 83 Caprice or something like that. But but vehicle prices, they've really gone up. Used cars are expensive. Vehicles, good night. If you buy a truck now, you've got to sell a kidney to be able to get a truck. And so it's amazing what's going on with vehicle prices. So you have that. But also, when you buy that vehicle, you're going to pay some sales tax on top of it. And then there's tax, tag, and dock fees, all that mess that you pay on top of it. But once you've got it, whether it's a new car or a new-to-you car, it's great starting off with that, but very soon, in a matter of months, you've got to start spending some money on it, just doing regular maintenance. So many times it used to be that we would do our oil changes ourselves, but we've gotten too lazy or too good for that, and so we go to get an oil change now. What is that? I don't know, $800 to get an oil change now? So there's that. Filters have to be replaced. Now, there's that in-cabin air filter now, though, too. They snuck that one in there, so we'd have to change that as well. There's belts, there's hoses. You got to get the transmission service. If you don't get your transmission service periodically, you're going to have to replace a transmission. There's tires. Tires also are not cheap, and that kind of stinks, though, too. You spend all this money to buy a new set of tires, you put them on there, and literally nothing is different. Well, you just got new tires, and your wallet got a lot lighter. So there's all of these expenses, and there's always something that's going on, always something that's due on a vehicle. And if there's not something that's due in terms of regular maintenance, something breaks, and you've got to get that fixed. And always there's some sort of cost that's involved with that. But then there's the cost of taxes. There is the taxes when you purchase the vehicle, but then we're blessed every year with the wonderful opportunity to pay property taxes on our vehicle. Don't we love that? And so you have to go get it inspected first now, which that's another tax. And so that once you get that, then you can pay your property taxes that are due each year. And by the way, if your car is nicer, your taxes are greater. So, get a clunker, right? But anyway, so you've got that. But also, cars don't just move with fairy dust. You got to put gas in them now, unless you've got an electric vehicle. But if you're going to put gas in it, so gas prices are expensive. But even in every gallon of gas that you purchase, you're spending a fair amount just in tax on every gallon. There's 14 cents in every gallon of gas that you pump that's federal gas tax that goes to help pay for roads and digging new potholes so that you can hit them. And so there's federal gas tax. In North Carolina, there's 41.5 cents on every single gallon that is going to the state of North Carolina to help take care of roads and maintenance and bridges and all of those things. So 14 cents, another 41 cents on every single gallon. We are constantly getting just boom, 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 boom. It's oil changes, it's tire rotations, it's transmission service, it's property tax, it's vehicle tax, it's all of these things. Why in the world, if I walk outside this building now, is the building surrounded by vehicles? We've got all of these headaches, we've got all of these hassles. We got all these pains, we have all of these costs, but why do we have all these vehicles surrounding this building? Because the benefit is greater than the cost. We're willing to do and to pay all of those costs because we like the benefit of not walking, of getting rapidly from one place to another. The benefit is so good, it leads us to endure taking care of and having to deal with the tough stuff. We're thinking about this as part of this ongoing journey that we're calling This Is Us. Each week since the second week in January, we've been thinking about some of these basic essentials that we see in the life of a person, a family, and a church where God is able to work, where He's able to move and bless, as we see in Acts chapter 2. And one of the things that we saw was that they were biblically grounded. They were meaningfully related. We see that they were prayerfully focused and they were gospel-centered. We're spending some time thinking about each of those essentials. And for the past couple of weeks, we've been thinking about this whole prospect of experiencing, as a church family, having meaningful connections and being meaningfully related to each other. And hopefully we can all agree with the notion that that's very pleasant. We like that. I mean, it's wonderful, the thought that we can have sometimes even relationships with others as part of a church family that are even closer than biological family, that as we're going through life's ups and downs, we've got somebody with skin on them to walk through the experiences of life with, that can help deal with the absence of loved ones, to help us to avoid loneliness. Besides that, to have their giftedness be used to speak truth and help me become more like Jesus, and for me to use my gifts to make them more become like Christ. There's all of these wonderful benefits that we're able to experience as we are meaningfully related to each other. And it's very easy for us to focus on the love and the encouragement and the kindness and the hospitality and the laughter and the conversations and the kinship, the connectedness. And all of those things are wonderful, but understand this. If we are going to be meaningfully related, not nominally, not inconsequentially, but meaningfully related to one another, meaningful relationships involve sometimes some tough stuff. In fact, of necessity, meaningful relationships sometimes require, it's essential to experience confrontation. It's just the case. So as we think about this whole experience of being meaningfully connected, we want to think about this specific question today. Why is confrontation essential to experiencing meaningful relationships with other believers? Look with me in your Bibles today to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We're going to look at the first 8 verses. 1 Corinthians 5, starting with verse 1. Paul says this, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and the kind of sexual immorality that's not even tolerated among the Gentiles. A man is sleeping with his father's wife. And yet you're arrogant. Shouldn't you be filled with grief and remove from your congregation the one who did this? Even though I'm absent in the body, I'm present in spirit. As one who is present with you in this way, I've already pronounced judgment on the one who has been doing such a thing. When you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and I'm with you in spirit, with the power of the Lord Jesus, hand that one over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole batch of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new, unleavened batch, as indeed you are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore let us observe the feast not with old leaven or with the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." There's a number of direct applications from this passage, but one of the things that it does do is to help answer that question for us. Why is it that something that we would say is as unpleasant as confrontation, why is that essential to experiencing something that we deem to be so pleasant in experiencing meaningful relationships with other believers? I think based on what Paul says, we come away with a couple of answers, and the first is this. Unaddressed behaviors become the norm. Unaddressed behaviors become the norm. On Paul's second missionary journey, he felt like God was leading him to the city of Corinth which was a difference in what he initially anticipated in terms of his plans. And so he winds up going to Corinth, and he spends 18 months there. And during that 18 months, he's sharing the good news about Jesus. And individuals and families are hearing about what God in Christ has made possible, and people start following Jesus. And they're demonstrating through symbols what we saw Abigail demonstrate this morning, that she is in a relationship with Christ and seeking to follow him. And so that's wonderful what you see going on in Corinth. Paul is investing in these people. He's developed a significant relationship with them. He's been there for a year and a half. But then God leads him to go elsewhere to accomplish the same thing. And as he's gone, things begin to unravel. And there are some things that begin to creep into the life of the church at Corinth that are bad. A whole slew of problems. And he writes a total of 3 letters to them. We don't have the first one. What we know is 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter that was written to them. And then 2 Corinthians is the third letter. But in this particular letter, he's dealing with a number of issues, one of which you see starting in verse 1. He says, it's reported that there is sexual immorality among you. Now, as Paul is writing this, keep in mind that he is in the city of Ephesus. He's not in Corinth. He's not just down the street. He's 240 miles away from them. First century news doesn't travel very fast. Nothing travels very fast. And so 240 miles away, Paul hears what's going on at the church in Corinth. And what's going on? Well, there's some sexual immorality. But this is unusual because of the scope of it. He says that there is sexual immorality that's not even tolerated among Gentiles. In that instance, it's a reference to those that have no connection whatsoever with God. So pagans and God-haters and just people living it up, they don't do this type of thing. Yet within the church, you have a man having an incestuous relationship with his own mother. Who knows about this? Everybody knows. How do we know that? Because Paul is 240 miles away, and he knows about it. So is there any uncertainty about the awareness within the church family that this is going on? No, it seems like any and everyone knows this, but how is the church responding to this? He says in verse 2, he says, you're arrogant. In that statement, he's conveying this sense that you guys are operating as though there's stuff to be proud about. I guess it is that your side, look at all these numbers, and look at all these people, and look at all of these, our new buildings, and look at the new camel lot that we have out in the out beside the camel lot. Any of that was off the cuff. Thank you, Lord. Anyway, so they are so proud about their accomplishments. So many things that they're celebrating. Look at what we are doing. Look at what we are experiencing. He says, you're so arrogant. You're so prideful about your condition. But, he said, by contrast, shouldn't you be filled with grief? Shouldn't it break your heart that within the church family, there is someone who professes to be a follower of Jesus, who identifies with the people that are collectively following Jesus, yet it is the case that he is so estranged from God that he's having a sexual relationship with his own mother. This is crazy. This is insane. This ought to grieve you. It ought to lead you to do something. But what are you doing? Well, nothing. The implication here, and the text doesn't spell this out, but the implication is this. Every time the church gathers, this guy's there. This is not someone who is estranged from the fellowship that people are like, well, who's that? I've never heard of that. Well, I don't know. People know who this is, and they know what's going on, and who's saying anything? No one. But what are they doing? They're getting carpal tunnel from patting themselves on the back. Look how great we are. Look how wonderful things are. Look how wonderful the fellowship is. And we get together and we have so much fun and we enjoy our meals and our conversations. All of these, we are so connected, probably celebrating their relatedness, but it wasn't meaningful relationship because being meaningfully related means that if there is something that is damaging to the individual, something that is damaging to the body, do you know what you do? You do something. You do something. If you don't, If confrontation is not part of what you think to be meaningful relationships, what happens is that these unaddressed behaviors, over time, and it doesn't take much of it, well, that becomes the norm. On Friday morning, and honestly, mornings at our house are just chaos, and you might hear the screaming from your house, and it's just probably a lot of smoke and just fires burning and cannonballs. I mean, it's chaos in the morning. It just is. Friday morning, though, and we got people going in different places trying to get ready. There's a time crunch. And Caroline has been downstairs where we've got, there are the 3 oldest boys and Catherine are downstairs. And this has become a challenge. And so she announced to them that there is good news in their future. They're each getting a gift, a wonderful gift, the gift that keeps on giving, a clothes basket, a clothes hamper, whatever, something so that each of them can have their own clothes repository to put their clothes in, because she goes down there, and we keep having dealt with this, but nothing seems to change. And it is the case that she goes down there, and like there are clean clothes that just the previous night Caroline had folded. So these clothes have been folded, they have been delivered, and then they're on the floor mixed with dirty clothes. And if you tell them to clean the room, what happens? Clean clothes and dirty clothes, what happens to them? They go back into the hamper so that what? Same thing, over and over and over again. So Caroline said, I'm tired of this. You'll get your hamper with your clothes, and if your clothes are dirty, well, then you go to school stinking. It's your deal. And as you own this, maybe you'll start caring. Maybe this will start mattering. Maybe you'll quit acting like unbridled slobs. I'm going to go ahead and extend the invitation so that my children can come and kneel at the altar. No. She said this, though, and this statement stuck with me. She said this: what we tolerate, we live with. What we tolerate, we live with. And I don't want to live with this anymore. The church family there was tolerating this. And as such, what happened? That's what they were living with. It was the norm. The church gathers, and I don't know if son and mother sat together in church. I don't know. But everybody knows this. Paul is 240 miles away, and he knows about it. Everybody knows, but who's saying anything? No one. Oh, we're so wonderful. The church is doing so great. Everything is so just fantabulous. They were related, but not in any meaningful way. Because if they actually meant something to each other, somebody, some people would have confronted this and said, this is harmful to you, it's harmful to her, it's harmful to us, and this has to change. But no one would. And so what happened? That became the norm. That became the norm. When there is an absence of confrontation in the life of the people of God, those behaviors, whatever they are, what you don't address, what you tolerate, you live with, and they become the norm. Why does that matter? Because of the second reason that Paul communicates, and that's this. Unhealthy norms have a pervasive effect. Unhealthy norms have a pervasive effect. In verse 6, Paul leads these believers to think about the ongoing consequences of this behavior in the life of the church. But before we unpack that, think about, if you just start with read the first 2 verses, or even the first verse. All right, so it's reported that this is going on. What would the church at Corinth, what would the individuals, and collectively, what do you imagine their response would have been? In truth, it's probably the same thought that would be occurring in the minds of people in 2023. Well, you know, that's them. That's their little red wagon. I'm going to stay over here in my lane, and I'm going to mind my business. I'm going to keep my nose in my business, out of their stuff. I'm just going to be doing my thing as they are doing their thing. I know Valentine's was probably really strange for them, but that's all them. I'm going to mind my business. I'm going to stay over here. I'm going to stay in my lane. And we will pat ourselves on the back by saying, well, that's prudent. And that's how it should be. But by staying in your lane, even though this is known, as it goes unaddressed, it becomes the norm. It becomes what is continuing to go on. And Paul communicates that is a problem. And the reason it is a problem is because of what he describes using an illustration. Starting in verse 6, that it begins to have an effect on, and it does impact you. You can say, well, that doesn't affect me. That's their business. That's what's going on in behind closed doors with them. That's not me. That's not my family. That has nothing to do with me. I'm going to keep my blessed mouth shut. I'm not going to do anything. And Paul says, hold on just a moment. I want you to know this actually does affect you. This does have consequence. And he says, in verse 6, he says, you're boasting. You're patting yourselves on the back. He says, your boasting is not good. And then he says, rhetorically, don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole batch of dough? Here he's using an illustration in language and appealing to something that they understood. Here he's talking about bread making, and when he talks about leaven, he's talking about yeast, and he's saying that it doesn't take much yeast to leaven to cause an entire lump of dough to rise. I'm not a baker. I'm not the cook, the baker, or the candlestick maker. I'm not any of those things. I've eaten my fair share of bread, but I've never made bread before. And so reading this, I thought, and I knew that you don't have to use much leaven. You don't have to use much yeast if you're making bread. But just for giggles and fun, I had looked up the other day a recipe for yeast rolls, because yeast rolls are good, right? They're delicious. And so this recipe is called the best yeast rolls, which if you're going to call them something, that's a pretty good one. So these are the best ones. All right, so for the best yeast rolls, you need a half cup of whole milk, half cup granulated sugar, quarter cup of butter, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, a half cup of water, 4.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Now, doing with that, I just did the math. That's 6.25, so 6.25 cups of ingredients. And to that, you add 2 eggs. So it's 6.25 cups plus 2 eggs. How much is that? That's more than 1.5 quarts. So if you can picture a quart jar and a little bit more than 1/2 of a quart jar. Into that, you need to add, and you need to include some yeast. But how much? 2 teaspoons. 2 teaspoons. That's not much. Why don't we use, if we're using 4.5 cups of flour, why don't we use at least a good 1.5 cups of yeast? Why? Because a little bit has a big effect. A little bit causes that much larger lump of dough to rise. How much? Just a little bit. And Paul is saying this unaddressed behavior is going on in the life of the church. And it's just going on with this one particular individual and his mother, but he says this leavens the whole batch of dough. That's all of you. That's the entire church family. And it's not accidental that he's using the imagery here of yeast, because consistently, both in Old and New Testaments, yeast is always, virtually every time, synonymous with sin, with out-of-bounds behavior. And so if you begin to put this stuff together and you build a more complete thought, you have Paul saying this. You have an individual in the fellowship that gets bogged down and stuck in some sort of sin. Others know it, but no one confronts it. It continues to the point where others don't even think much about it. It just kind of becomes part of the background noise. It becomes part of the new normal. Again, you say, well, okay, this says that it affects me. How does this affect me? I think the greatest way that it affects you is that as behaviors become normal for others, as you view those as norms for others, do you know what you begin to do? Increasingly, you begin to view them as norms for yourself. So if this behavior falls into the acceptable category, so we're going to take it from really egregious, immoral sexual sin, and we're just going to put it over here into, well, it's just kind of how it is. The longer that I do this, what do I begin to do? I begin to start looking at myself and the decisions that I make, and I say what? Well, they're not so bad. I'm not looking for a romantic Mother's Day card. So what I'm doing, it's not so bad. And so what happens? This unaddressed behavior, it becomes norm, it becomes accepted. And then others begin to look at their own choices, their own out-of-bounds behavior, and they say, well, mine's not so bad as that. And collectively, what happens? Pervasively, bit by bit, and it didn't happen overnight, it doesn't occur immediately, but the very definition of sin and the very definition of what is and is not out-of-bounds behavior, well, increasingly, it just kind of disappears. And everybody's kind of doing what they want. Everybody's just paying no attention to the standards that God has created, and it has a pervasive effect on who? On everyone. On everyone. And it happens a little bit at a time. The church I served in Charlotte, they had for years, even before I got there, a big annual barbecue that it was a big deal. And I think the most that we ever cooked while I was there was like 8,000 pounds of barbecue. So, it was a big deal. Anyway, this was used to raise money to fund a mission project in West Virginia each summer. And it was something that had been going on for some years, like I said, well before I got there. And on the day that it was cooking, there were grills everywhere, and there was smoke everywhere, and there was meat and grease everywhere. And it took a lot of people to make this happen. And a lot of the guys, it always happened in February. And so February, it's cold, and you're outside with all these grills. And there was a guy, his name was Wayne. And Wayne was as good as gold, and he was a faithful part of this, was always excited to be a participant in this. And so Wayne would be part of the group that's participating throughout every aspect of this. But there was one particular year where Wayne was outside and they're tending to the grill. So we had some pranksters in the church, and I don't know where they would have, I don't know how I got along with them, but anyway, one of them, and then I guess a couple of them started to see, I wonder how many rocks we can put in Wayne's pocket. Because it's cold, he's got a coat on, and so as he's doing stuff, let's just put a little rock in his pocket. Well, I got one. And you got one. Wayne's got 2 rocks. Let's get another one. He didn't notice that. He didn't notice that one. Didn't notice that one. By the end of the day, Wayne goes to stick in his hands in his pocket, and he's got a pocket slap full of rocks. Why did that happen? Because the first one wasn't dealt with. And it became another, and it became another, became another, became another, and he wound up with a pocket full of rocks. Paul's saying that the church can wind up with a pocket full of rocks when unaddressed behaviors become the norm, and then that begins to have a pervasive effect on the entire family. Am I suggesting that we should relish this whole experience of confrontation? That we should relish having to go to someone and say, listen, I don't know if you've noticed this, but God's really burdened my heart to come to share. You've gotten stuck by this. Should we think that's fun and delightful and just, oh, goody, goody, I get to confront somebody. If you do, something's wrong with you. But this is the tough stuff. But why do we do the tough stuff? The same reason that we do the tough stuff, the unpleasant stuff of having a car, because the benefit outweighs the cost. Now, when we're thinking about this whole idea of experiencing meaningful relationships and being meaningfully related to each other, the root of meaningful is what? Meaning. The reality is, I should have meaning to you. You should have meaning to me. We should have meaning to each other. And if we actually mean something to each other, if someone is trapped in something, if they mean something to us, what do we want to do? We want to help them out. Do we do this in just any old fashion? No, Jesus described this. He said, why is it that you are trying to go highlight a splinter in your brother's eye, but you got a log hanging out of your own. He says, first get the log out of your own eye before going to deal with the splinter. So many times I think what we can do is to take Jesus' words and say, well, see, that's telling me I just need to stay in my lane, and I just need to think about me and make sure that my act is together. And that's not an encouragement to do that. It's an encouragement of how you start. How you start is to say, Lord, help me to see what I might have been blind to that is out of bounds, that is harming me, that is dishonoring and is displeasing to you. Help me see that and get that out of my life before I ever have a conversation with somebody else. Because you know why? Having a log in your eye is no good. But you know what? Neither is having a splinter in it. If we mean and actually have relationships with each other that truly are meaningful, this is going to be an essential component. So the question is, those around you that are part of this church family, I'm not asking, are you nominally related? Do you know who they are? But are you meaningfully related? It may be that there is something that God has been burdening you about to have a conversation with, and you've been avoiding it. And God's showing you this very simply this morning. If they meant something to you, you'd say something. Will you bow your heads with me?